all you have to do to deal with a lot of the worst, a lot of the great difficulties in our view of nature as property and nothing but, or sometimes not even as property, just a thing that doesn't belong to anybody and you just dump whatever you want there, is to at least allow standing, meaning that any person can bring an action on its behalf. And that's what's made it into law in Ecuador. And what you may be absolutely startled to learn at the end is something that looks like it could make it into law in New Zealand, but we'll get to that at the end. Now, the passage of this concept of standing for non-human nature is a great example of what I've been getting at with multi-level governance and participation. Okay, so, because what happened in the Constituent Assembly was there was this, an organization called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CELDF, based in Pennsylvania in the US, which worked very closely with the Constituent Assembly to put this particular provision into the Constitution of Ecuador. In 2006 in the US, in Tava Borough, in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, the Borough Council passed an ordinance. Under provisions that they have in the US, some states have what they call home rule, meaning that they are able to pass provisions that would not be constitutionally possible in most other states. But just because of the heavily negotiated and mediated process of states joining the Union in the US, there are certain states, and Pennsylvania is one of them, where they have these home rule provisions, which means that they can actually bring into law provisions that allow them to do things that would not be constitutionally acceptable in other parts of the country. And what they did was there was a corporation that was applying what they called sludge, which was actually untreated human sewage, which they were spraying on fields. People died. They got sick and died as a result of this practice, and it caused appalling damage to the local streams and river systems. So people were really radicalized by this experience and put into law an ordinance at the council level banning corporations from applying the sludge to the land, recognizing enforceable rights of ecosystems. So in that county, you were able to, you no longer had to have your property affected or your individual interest affected, right to, against nuisance or right to quiet enjoyment or whatever affected. All you had to do was say, I would like to represent this tributary of this river that's being polluted by this practice. And you would be able to bring an action on its behalf as a guardian or a steward. They asserted that corporations doing business in Temako Borough were to be treated as state actors and were required to respect the rights of non-human nature in the borough. Really quite extraordinary stuff. The wording that they came up with was startlingly similar, because it was put in by the same people, to the Ecuadorian Constitution's Article 71. And Article 71 reads like this: that nature, or Pachamama, where life is reproduced and exists, has the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its cycles, etc. So it has an intrinsic worth, is the point of this first paragraph. Not an instrumental value, not its worth as much as we can sell it for, or as much money as we can borrow against it, but it has a worth and a value in and of itself. And that's a new concept. That, believe it or not, is a revolutionary concept in law. That this thing has a right in and of itself, even though it's not human. And here's the real action part, that every person, anyone, people, community, or nationality will be able to demand the recognition of rights for nature before the public organisms, which means the adjudication or review bodies. The application and interpretation of these rights will follow the related principles established in the Constitution. And as you've seen, the related principles are whatever you want. This is revolutionary. This was a fundamental change in the way anything that's not human is treated in the law. It's a clear and explicit, first one I've been able to find in history and in the world in my researches, where a national constitution has actually recognized the intrinsic worth of something rather than just its instrumental value, what worth it is to us. So a fundamental change. So there are some challenges, of course, to the application of these broad, these provisions. I was going to do a run through of cases that have recently been brought, but first of all, there haven't been many in the last 5 years. The Ecuadorian government, although they've made a lot of very rapid legislative changes, have inherited the bureaucracy and the judicial system of previous governments, which moves at an incredibly slow pace. So most of the cases that were brought, and there were many enthusiastic applications shortly after it became law, are just still in the process. What has happened in practice was that there were challenges brought to large infrastructural processes. Rerouting the river was one, and they were just going to take the bend out of a river, which was going to destroy an entire floodplain, an area that people lived off. And it was the first time that in Ecuador, and indeed anywhere in the world, that you were able to bring an action, not because of the fact that those people would be affected, or that somebody downstream would be affected, and having to submit long scientific reports and have a contest of experts about, the silt will end up down here and it'll have this effect and so on, what we have to do in our resource management law. And whoever can afford the best experts will generally win. It was the first time anywhere that it was possible to actually say this river is an entity of its own, that it's its own ecosystem, it's its own living thing. And what we're essentially doing is amputating a part of it and leaving it untreated. It was the first time that this was actually treated at and looked at as being something that was, a living thing of its own. So what happened in practice was that they put a little bit less of a straightening in the river. So not the most exciting first result, but the thing is that it was possible. And this is the thing that in time, this will have a very substantial effect. And its precedent effect, as always in law, is the most important thing. It's being done now. It's a thing that can happen, and it's a thing that can be referred to, and that many other countries are looking at incorporating. But the thing is, these countries are all rolling out. These are generally, or without exception, in fact, Latin American countries are very poor. There've been decades of either no infrastructural investment or previous infrastructural investment, healthcare and education being run down. Large portions of the population suffering from the lifelong consequences of easily preventable childhood diseases, lack of proper medical care, lack of education, the basic sort of human rights that need to be looked after. And there are radically successful programs being run under the sort of broadly the leadership of Venezuela and Cuba, but throughout these countries. Countries also tend to have very, very strong democratic credentials. Hugo Chavez, who very recently passed away, was often referred to as a dictator, as a strongman. This was a dictator who won 14 elections. Elections that were observed very, very closely by international observers. Jimmy Carter, who this is what he does now, is goes around the world and observes elections. And he said, look, I've seen elections all over the world, and these are the most impeccably democratic elections I've ever seen. The boxes were clear perspex. They're only handled by children under the age of 15, or at least that's where they started. And the way you do a ballot, there were no hanging chads. There was no, did they cross this box or that box? You actually have a little touch screen like an iPad, and you tick your options, and then it prints something out. It says, hey, make sure you check that. Is that right? Yes. And then you put it in the box. And they have been scrutinized by people who, believe me, want to question, want to challenge the integrity of these elections, and they have not been able to find irregularities. Extraordinary. Compare that to Florida in the early 2000s. The challenges are, however, that there are urgent human rights that need to be taken care of. And these are being funded by heavy infrastructure and roading projects, many of which are going across the Amazon. There is a motorway being built called the Manta-Manaus highway, which will go clear across the top of Latin America. It will go straight through the Amazon. And what roads mean, one of the things that's been characteristic of the Amazon is its inaccessibility. There are people such as the Waorani who have been essentially uncontacted. There are parts of the Amazon, there are tribes where no person who isn't one of them has ever gone and survived. Uncontacted. They live exactly as they have for thousands of years. But when roads come through, that's not the case anymore. And the thing is, what always tends to happen, and roads are they run trucks and miners and loggers and so on. And often people who bring, or shall we say, socially challenging situations, bars spring up, brothels, you know, to service these sorts of communities, and you end up with, you know, a lot of diseases that were completely unknown, people who have no immunity. You know, it's essentially the experience of early colonization all over again throughout these countries, and causing enormous environmental damage as well. But it's these infrastructural investments and the mining programs, particularly oil. This is a not uncommon sight in the Amazon. Just an unsealed pit, Tava. There would have been a well nearby, and that's where they pour out the sludge that they don't like. There've been a number of, there was an absolutely massive award, many billions of dollars that was awarded against Chevron or Texaco.